So, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me on this episode on the Odyssey with Professor Armand D'Angour, the Professor of Classical Languages and Literature at the University of Oxford. Welcome, Professor.
Hello, thank you.
Yes, thank you for being here and in such a timely episode with Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey coming out in, I think, a couple of weeks maybe, or a week. So
Yep.
I know a lot of people are excited about that, and I'm excited to have an opportunity to sit down with one of the greats to discuss one of the greats, or maybe two of the greats. With that, I think we should just go ahead and get started. I think two questions to help us contextualize the Odyssey. Who wrote it and when?
As far as we know, the Odyssey was originally sung, so it wasn't written, but the person who we say composed it, and composed it, we believe, through various kinds of evidence, in a semi-improvised way, using formulas to stick together verses, hundreds, thousands of verses, was called by the ancients Homer. Homer was the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but in the 8th century BC, when we believe Homer lived, some people don't even believe in such a person, but I do. Homer lived in the 8th century and was an oral bard, so someone who had been trained to sing narrative songs to the accompaniment of a lyre of some kind without the use of writing. So when we say who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, what we mean perhaps is, where do our texts of the Iliad and the Odyssey come from? And they come from 5 centuries later, more or less. So sometime in the 3rd century BC, the texts of the Iliad and the Odyssey, as we know them, were established by scholars in Alexandria, in Egypt, which was the center of the Greek world after the conquest of Alexander the Great. And they decided, on the basis of a lot of manuscripts that they had come across and they were able to sift and edit, that they could create the canonical monumental poems, one the Iliad, the other the Odyssey, and these were the poems that have then survived in Greek from antiquity and are now known as the epics of Homer.
Understood. Excellent. And so you talked about both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, as I understand it, in order for us to start with the Odyssey, we need a little bit of a backstory from the Iliad, or maybe the conclusion of the Iliad. So before we jump into the Odyssey, can you just tell us what backstory we need to know from the Iliad?
We really need to understand the Trojan War. So the Trojan War is a series of battles fought over the course of 10 years. I mean, this is the myth of the Trojan War. I mean, there is a historical underlying truth to it. But the mythical story of the Trojan War is that it was caused by the theft of Helen of Sparta by the Trojan prince Paris, or Alexander. He has 2 names. And he had been a guest of King Menelaus in Sparta, the Greek king, and had fallen in love with Helen and took her with him back to Troy. So the Greeks, under Menelaus' brother Agamemnon, got a huge army together consisting of lots of Greek states which supplied ships and soldiers, and they sailed to Troy, so across the Aegean to what is now Turkey, and they sailed to the city of Troy and they camped on the beach, and they besieged Troy, which was a walled city, and it has been discovered. Archaeology has uncovered these walls. So it was very difficult to actually conquer, but they besieged it for 10 years. And then at the end of that 10-year period, Odysseus, one of the heroes, one of the warriors of the Greeks, came up with the ruse to pretend that they were leaving the siege. And what he did is he created this huge wooden horse, claimed that it was an offering to the goddess of Athena for the homecoming of the Greeks. The Trojans dragged it in as an offering to the goddess that they themselves also worshipped into their citadel. And at the dead of night, the hollow belly of the horse emptied out dozens of Greek soldiers. And they then destroyed the Trojans and killed them. And that was the end of the Trojan War. And after that, the heroes had to return home to their homes in Greece. And we know of a few homecomings. Most of them were difficult and unsuccessful. Menelaus did, in the end, manage to get back to Sparta with Helen that he'd gone to rescue from Troy. Agamemnon returned to Argos, where he was killed by his wife Clytemnestra. And the Odyssey tells us the opposite story. It begins by referencing the fact that Agamemnon, who had led the expedition, returned to his city, Mycenae, in fact, and that he had been killed there when he got back. But it said that that was because his wife was unfaithful and brutal, unlike Penelope, who was the wife of the other hero, Odysseus, who was faithful and waited for him for 20 years, 10 years during the siege of Troy, and 10 years when he was making his arduous and circuitous homecoming, his return home to Ithaca, and experiencing all kinds of adventures. And it is that story that is the story of the Odyssey.
Excellent, excellent. So, in the Iliad, we have a number of heroes, we have a number of great people. One of them is Achilles, who is this legendary figure who had a considerable influence on some later historical persons. One is Alexander the Great. We are told, apparently, that he slept with a part of the Iliad under his bed, or under his pillow, rather, right? And great hero, a lot of cool feats. What sets Odysseus apart from the other characters in the Iliad in that he gets his own, epic? It's a great composition.
Well, that's an interesting question, and we can perhaps assume that there were other stories of the returns of heroes, some of which were, as I said, successful, such as Menelaus's, others which were less successful, such as Agamemnon's. And the reason I say that we can make that assumption is that in the beginning of the Odyssey, Odysseus is still absent from Ithaca, and the bard on Ithaca, a bard called Phemius, is singing songs. And those songs are indeed called the homecomings of the Greeks. They're called Achaeans in the Homeric text, but those are the Greeks of that time. And Penelope, who is in the palace, hears the bard singing of these homecomings, and she tells him to stop, because she says, it distresses me, because every time I hear about these homecomings, I remember Odysseus, who hasn't come home, and who's probably out there or dead. And at this moment, the son of Odysseus and Penelope, whose name is Telemachus, intervenes, and he says to his mother, don't stop the bard singing what he wants to do. Not only do people want to hear the latest song, because that's the one they most enjoy, but, he, in his mind, is thinking, let the suitors who are listening to this song, the people who are trying to sue for Penelope's hand and are eating up the wealth and substance of the palace, let them imagine that Odysseus might well come home. So I think he's quite pleased with the idea that other people might think Odysseus too will return. In any case, that is what happens at the beginning. And so, as I say, other returns, but Odysseus is rather different from the other heroes. I mean, they all have their individual characteristics, but in the Iliad, Odysseus is very much a counterpart to Achilles. He is a great hero as well in a military sense, but he also has an ability to talk. He's a great orator. and it's one of the things that he is known to be. He's skilled at speech. And also, I think the combination of that and the fact that he has got a faithful wife back home makes the perfect foil for the Iliad. Instead of a story of warfare and fighting and success in that regard, what we have is Odysseus who's able to talk his way out of tricky situations, who will be a bit of a trickster character because he will be able to trick his way out of peril. And also, he is a king who can reassert his right to rule in his land of Ithaca. So, various different things that go into making the Odyssey a different kind of poem, but one that matches very nicely, that complements the fighting of the Iliad, and ends with Odysseus taking bloody revenge on the suitors and killing them all. And that is a different sort of ending from the Iliad ending, which is much more about reparation between the two great enemies, between the Trojans and the Greeks, a temporary reparation when Achilles makes peace with Priam. Whereas the Odyssey, the crucial point of the ending is his return, his revenge, his slaying of the suitors. Though Greeks being Greeks, they understood that you can't kill people without having some kind of recompense response. And in fact, the last book of the Odyssey goes into how the families of the suitors are now gathering to try and get their own revenge on Odysseus. That has to come to an end, and the only way it can come to an end is by the intervention of the goddess Athena. And so she puts an end to all of that. So that's the sort of tidying up that was necessary from a sociological point of view, we might say. But actually, the story really ends with the killing of the suitors and the reunion of Odysseus with Penelope.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for the spoiler, Professor. Because I was just about to ask you, now that we've figured out what happens at the end of the Iliad, we could jump into the Odyssey. And so we know some of the main characters. Obviously, there's Odysseus, and then there's Penelope. You mentioned also Athena. Now, Athena is a goddess. So could you just tell us what is the relationship between what is this, what's the Greek pantheon? What is the relationship between the heroes in these stories and the gods, and the readers of these stories, or rather the listeners of these stories, and the gods?
Yes. So, as you say, Athena is very present in the Odyssey. She is the person who supports and looks after Odysseus. Now, the reason for that is that she is one of this pantheon, as you call it, a group of gods who supposedly live happy lives on Olympus and look down at human beings and intervene because they like some mortals and not others. This seems to be a pantheon which Homer might have inherited from Near Eastern sources. So we know of a similar kind of council of gods in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Near Eastern epic. The gods then are a sort of group of immortals who look on, perhaps for their entertainment, the way mortals fight and die and so on. And in some cases, they are actually the parents of those heroes. So when we talk about mortals such as Achilles or Aeneas in the Iliad, in fact, we know that they are descended themselves from gods at some level. Achilles' own mother, Thetis, is a divine nymph. She's not an Olympian goddess, but she is a goddess who has access to Olympus. Aeneas's mother is Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who has had Aeneas with a mortal man, Anchises. So there is some genealogical relationship with the gods for most of the heroes. But these gods were worshipped in historical times. They had temples. The Greeks believed that it was important to supplicate them and to pray to them and so on, and to give them sacrifices. So the question is, did Homer inherit Greek gods as a pantheon, or did he create the way the gods appear? And the Greeks generally thought that he had created that. He and a fellow bard called Hesiod, they said, were responsible for giving us our gods as we know them today. So he presents the gods in this way. They're all related in some sense. Zeus has fathered quite a few of the gods, as well as marrying them. So he's married to Hera, but he has numerous affairs, and he has fathered some of the other gods too. Zeus, Apollo, they're all very active in the story. Hermes, who's a junior god, is very often sent as a messenger to the mortals down below. But the core of the relationship between Athena and Odysseus goes back to the reason that the whole thing began, which was the judgment of Paris, Alexander, who was asked to judge between three goddesses as to which was the fairest. So that is the story that is just touched on in Homer, but we know from other sources in much greater detail. And that is that the three goddesses, Hera, the wife of Zeus, Athena, and Aphrodite, were at this wedding, and the apple was thrown in by Strife, who hadn't been invited, and on it said, "For the fairest." And who was to get this apple? They decided they'd ask Paris for various reasons. He was known to be an honourable judge. He was a shepherd on Ida. And he had the choice, and they offered him what they were capable of offering. Hera gave him lordship over Europe and Asia. That's what she said, "I can give you if you choose me." Athena gave him great skill in battle, which is what she was known for. She's the goddess of warfare, amongst other things. A great skill in battle and cunning wisdom. Those are the attributes of Athena. And Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in Greece. Now, what was a young shepherd to choose? He chose Aphrodite as the fairest, and his reward was to seduce Helen of Sparta, who was the most beautiful woman in Greece, in the world. And that's where the whole war began. So the judgment of Paris then sets the gods on different sides. Hera and Athena are inevitably really very unhappy about the choice, and they treat the Trojans as their enemies, their deadly enemies, and they are trying throughout the Iliad to make sure that the Achaeans, the Greeks, have the upper hand. Aphrodite is desperate to help her side, doesn't have much power compared to these other gods who are ranged against her. So that survives through to the Odyssey, where Athena remains a great supporter of her favorite Achaean warrior, who is Odysseus, and she oversees him through his return to Ithaca, and she helps him in his various moments of danger, and she advocates for him, and sometimes she actually appears to him either as herself or in disguise in order to help move along the story. And so that's the situation that we're in which Athena is very important as Odysseus' helper.
Excellent. And so we have all these different figures. We don't yet have Odysseus. So we could just jump right in and, I don't know where the best place is to start with the Odyssey.
Let's start at book one, and it begins with the Council of the Gods, in which Zeus says, look, human beings, they are responsible for their own downfall. So that's already an interesting point that he's making. It's something that we learn throughout the Odyssey, that human beings make mistakes, and they often blame the gods. But here, Zeus is saying they are responsible for their own downfall, and he goes on to talk about how Agamemnon returned home and was killed by his wife Clytemnestra, and in turn, Orestes, their son, is going to take revenge and kill his mother Clytemnestra, which he did. So that kind of response to killing, the retribution that is inevitable, is something that Zeus is picking up on, and he is essentially saying that this is what's going to happen to these suitors who are there acting as Odysseus' enemies. We know, in a way, this is going to be a story of vengeance and retribution, which indeed it becomes. So there's that theme, and there's the theme of Penelope by contrast, so it's implicit. This is what a bad wife does, but Penelope is a good wife. When we get to the end of the Odyssey, by a kind of ring composition, a lot of time is spent talking about how Penelope was a true and faithful wife. And so one of the things that I would say is that the Odyssey is much more sort of woman-oriented than the Iliad. Inevitably, it's not just a story about killing and so on. There are quite a lot of women active in the Odyssey, but perhaps more on the Trojan side, which is a settled city where there are women folk active. But here, women of some kind, whether they're goddesses or mortal women, are very important throughout, to the extent that in the 19th century, Samuel Butler wrote a book called The Authoress of the Odyssey, suggesting that it was actually written by a woman. So that's book one, where it begins with the Council of the Gods and setting up the theme of vengeance and so on. But as you say, Odysseus is not present. We are in the palace at Ithaca, and the bard is singing his song about the return of the heroes, and Penelope interrupts him, and we begin to understand immediately the antipathy between Telemachus, the son of Penelope and Odysseus, and the suitors. Of course, somehow Telemachus should have inherited the palace, but somehow, and the sociology of this is not clear, Penelope holds the power, and whoever marries her will inherit the palace of Ithaca. And so that is what the suitors are doing. They're trying to marry Penelope and actually edge Telemachus off the scene. And indeed, they are plotting to kill him. So Telemachus is aware of all of this. He's visited by a man who is called Mentes. In fact, it's Athena in disguise, which he realizes at the very end. And she gives him hope that Odysseus is still alive. So although the assumption of Penelope is that Odysseus is probably dead, and Telemachus even says the same thing, he then learns that actually Odysseus may well be alive and sets out to find out what from other heroes who've returned home, particularly Menelaus in Sparta and Nestor, the old counselor, warrior in Pylos, to find out whether they know any news of Odysseus. And so he sets out for both those places, Sparta and Pylos, to ask those questions. Of course, they don't know the answer. They tell him about their adventures, and he meets Menelaus and Helen in a nice domestic situation. But that's the first 4 books of the Odyssey. It's sometimes called the Telemachy, because it's about Telemachus. But, of course, the idea that Odysseus is there somewhere is hanging over all of these books. And when we get to book 5, we finally meet Odysseus. Where is he? He's not in Sparta or Pylos or anywhere like that. He's on a magical island called Ogygia, where he has been for 7 years. And he is shacked up with a beautiful goddess or nymph called Calypso. And you would have thought he's got everything that he wants. But he says, much as I love, being with you, beautiful as you are, goddess, I long for my homeland and I long for my wife, Penelope. And one gets the impression that she might be a little bit miffed by this because she rather likes being with Odysseus, but she understands and she allows him, she instructs him how to build a raft so that he can set off in order to get back home. And that is what he then does. he sets off. But what has happened in the previous adventures before he's been with Calypso, the reason he's on his own with Calypso is he's lost all his companions. And one of the reasons for that is the anger of another god, and that is the god Poseidon, the god of the ocean and of earthquakes. And Poseidon is furious with Odysseus and wants to avenge himself, or rather avenge his son, whom Odysseus blinded, and that is the Cyclops. So, that is another piece of vengeance that dogs Odysseus throughout his adventures, and as a result of that, Poseidon has shipwrecked Odysseus a number of times, and when he sets out on his raft, he is shipwrecked again, ends up on another magical island called Scheria, where the Phaeacians are the inhabitants. And he's washed up, book 6, he's washed up on the shore of Scheria, and there is the young princess Nausicaa. And she boldly manages to recognize that he is a man of stature, despite the fact that he's naked and covered in brine and covering himself with a branch as he emerges from his sleep on the shore, and he falls at her knees and she accepts him and she takes him back to the palace of her father Alcinous and her mother Arete, and they act as good hospitable Greeks should act. They invite him in, they give him fresh clothes, they wash him, and then they ask his story at a banquet. And so for several books of the Odyssey then, we have Odysseus telling his story, telling how he came to be alone, shipwrecked from a raft, having spent 7 years on the island of Calypso. But he gives us the story about how after he left Troy, various things happened to him and his companions, which gradually meant that his companions died. And one of the points that Zeus makes in the very first book is that the companions themselves are foolish because they died according to their own follies. They had slaughtered the cattle of the sun. So when Odysseus and his companions had washed up on one of those islands, the cattle of the sun were grazing. They were told they shouldn't touch them, but they got hungry and they thought, you know what, Odysseus went off looking for things to eat, but they thought, well, here are these cattle, so they killed them. The sun god Helios, of course, was not happy with this, and this is another reason why his companions are doomed to die one by one. So he goes to Phaeacia, he tells this story. It's a series of amazing stories. I mean, in some ways, this is the whole central bit of the Odyssey, which so many of us remember. His encounter with the Cyclops, in particular, but his encounter with other monstrous creatures and cannibals. Can
I bother you to tell us the story of the Cyclops? Because I love that story, and my kids oddly love that story as well. And I think I'd love to hear it from you.
It's a fantastic story, of course, because the Cyclops is a one-eyed giant. He lives on an island with a series of other one-eyed giants called Cyclopes. This one is called Polyphemus. And Odysseus and his companions stumble on this island and they find Polyphemus's cave. And it's got lots of lovely cheeses and all sorts of goodies. And they help themselves. And when the Cyclops returns in the evening, because he's a pastoral figure and he comes back with his sheep and goats, he comes into the cave, he closes it with a huge boulder, huge giant, and he sees all these men. He says, who are you and what are you doing? Eating my cheese. And Odysseus says, well, we came in the hope that we might find you as a hospitable host, which of course is what Greeks would expect. And, we can offer you wine and so on, because they have these bags of wine which they've brought with them, the best wine. And the Cyclops is basically not interested, and he grabs two of Odysseus's men and he bashes their brains against a rock and he eats them raw. And Odysseus says, well, look, try some of my wine. He tries it, he likes it, and he says, what's your name? He says, I will eat you last. That's what he'll give him. I'll eat you last, he says. And Odysseus cleverly says, well, my name is No Man. So that's the name he gives, No Man or No One. The Cyclops then proceeds to eat the companions bit by bit, and Odysseus and his companions, the remaining ones, have to escape. And what they plan to do is to blind the Cyclops, but they have to also escape from the cave. So they get him drunk. They then get a fir tree and they whittle it down and they push it into his one eye, and it sizzles, we're told, like an iron axe that has been heated up and then tempered in water. And the Cyclops wakes up and screams, and when her fellow Cyclopes say to him, who is hurting you? He shouts, no man is hurting me. They think he's gone mad. So there they are, stuck in this cave, which the Cyclops is making sure they can't get out of. So whenever he takes his sheep out to graze, he immediately shuts this boulder. And then when he comes back in, the same thing. And he's waiting to see and hear movement. Well, he can't see, of course, to hear and feel any kind of movement. And so the trick that Odysseus comes up with to get him and his companions out of the cave is to have them hang underneath the sheep. And so he has them hang under a group of 3 sheep. He ties them in so that the sheep can go out together, each 3 carrying a man underneath. And he himself hangs on to the underside of a very big ram, who normally goes out first. So when, in the morning, the Cyclops pulls the boulder back to let his animals out, and his hands are there to feel if any man is escaping, and he's feeling the top of his sheep. And then he at last comes the ram, and he's saying, why are you so slow today? You're usually first out of the door. Of course, the ram is slow because he's got Odysseus hanging. And so out they go. And Odysseus, instead of just escaping, they get to their ship and they can go. But of course, he wants to boast about it. So he shouts, yes, you thought it was no man who hurt you, but it was me, Odysseus. At which point, the Cyclops curses Odysseus and he asks his father Poseidon to give Odysseus his comeuppance, which is why things don't happen easily. The next stage then is that they, after various adventures, they end up in, for example, so Odysseus is telling us these stories on the island of Circe, the sorceress who turns his companions into animals, and Odysseus has to find a way of turning them back into human beings and forces Circe to do his will. And incidentally, having had a good time with Calypso on her island, he now has a good time with Circe on this island. I mean, there is a slight sense that Homer, telling the story, wants Odysseus to be quite a naughty guy having a jolly good time. He wants to have his cake and eat it. He's got his faithful Penelope waiting for him back home, but in the meantime, he's enjoying himself first with Calypso, then with Circe, and so on. So finally, he ends up on the island of Aeolus, who is the god of the winds. Aeolus gives him some winds to get him back to Ithaca, and off he goes, but he falls asleep, and the winds that he's got in this bag, his companions think, oh, there must be some treasure in it. They open the bag, and the winds go all over the place, and so the boat then is swept back to the island of Aeolus, who is not at all pleased with this and sends them off angrily. And then finally, after all the companions have been lost en route, he ends up where he is telling the story on Phaeacia. So that's this central part of these wonderful stories told by Odysseus. there's some question about whether we're meant to believe them. I mean, after all, this isn't Homer telling us a narrative story. This is Homer getting Odysseus to do a flashback with lots of narratives. And one of the other key points of this narrative of Odysseus is that he goes to the underworld at the instruction of Circe. So in a way, that's his final adventure. He goes down to the underworld and he meets many ghosts. Those are some of his former companions, like Achilles and Ajax, who walks away because, of course, they were heroes who fought for the armor of Achilles, and Odysseus won. And he meets his own mother, who he didn't know had died, and she says, yes, I died, but your father is at home waiting for you. So it's a kind of prophetic visit to the underworld. But again, as I say, this is Odysseus telling the story. Are we meant to take it at face value or not? I mean, to some extent, I think we probably are. We should say, and I expect Nolan will have, treated these as Odysseus' real adventures. So not just a tall tale that he's telling, not a piece of his imagination. These are his adventures. I think we take them at face value. He then goes on from Phaeacia. They send him away. He does then get finally to Ithaca, his home city, his home island. And there he meets Telemachus, who is waiting for him, eventually reveals himself to Telemachus. But he has to disguise himself as a beggar so that the suitors don't simply kill him. And he goes to the palace. He is recognized by his aged dog, and this is another wonderful moment where the dog Argos, who's waited for him for 20 years, you imagine this ancient hunting dog, sitting on a dung heap because the suitors and the servants have not treated this dog well, recognizes his master Odysseus and wags his tail and tries to lick him, but Odysseus has to just turn away because the swineherd Eumaeus is with him and he doesn't want to give away his identity to Eumaeus. He turns away and sheds a tear, and the dog wags his tail, delighted at last to see his master, and dies. So this is a moment of deep pathos and shows a love of animals that we find elsewhere in ancient Greek stories. So Odysseus then goes to the palace, and there, as a beggar, he is not, again, treated hospitably. So, I mean, the question of hospitality has come up a lot of times. The lack of hospitality given by the Cyclopes, the good hospitality given by the Phaeacians, and so on. Here, the suitors who are being disgraceful in terms of taking advantage of hospitality in Odysseus' home treat the beggar very inhospitably. But at one stage, Penelope then suggests that there is this contest to come to a head. You know, you've all been waiting to decide who's going to marry me. Let's have a contest, see who can shoot an arrow through a series of axes which are set up. The suitors can't even string Odysseus' bow. It is that difficult to string it, and someone suggests that maybe this beggar could do it. And they all laugh and they say, well, yeah, let's watch this beggar trying to do it. And of course, Odysseus then stands up, strings his bow, plucks the string. It makes a sound like a returning swallow. It's a wonderful moment. And then fits his arrow to it and shoots Antinous through the throat. So that's the first of the suitors to die. And he then proceeds to kill with Telemachus the other 107 suitors. And they take complete and wholesale revenge on the suitors and on those who had been unfaithful to them. And then we have this moment where Odysseus then goes to Penelope. She's seen all this happening, and yet she doesn't know that it's him. And there's this wonderful recognition scene where she tries to trick him into telling her who he really is, and she tells her maidservants to move the bed. At which point Odysseus gets really annoyed. He says, "What do you mean? You cannot move my bed because it was carved out of the trunk of a tree. So it stays in its place." Only he knows that. That is a trick she's playing on him. She breaks down and cries and says, "I'm sorry. I had to know it was you, and now I do know." It's beautifully done. She has finally outwitted the man whose cleverness has outwitted so many others in the course of the story. The idea that they're somehow equals in cunning is very important to this story. The return of Odysseus to his home, to Penelope, who is like-minded, the word in Greek homophoron, of the same mind as her brilliant husband. And that's, as it were, the end of the story as what we might see it. They go to bed with each other and they spend the night in lovemaking, we're told. And then in the morning, they tell each other their different stories. And of course, it doesn't in fact end there. It goes on for another book and a half. And the book that follows has all the suitors in the underworld, the dead suitors, the ghost suitors, complaining that really Odysseus, they need to avenge themselves on Odysseus. And that is where Agamemnon is there saying how wonderful Penelope was and how faithful she'd been. And then Athena, the goddess, comes and stops all the discussions on Ithaca about how vengeance should be taken against Odysseus. So it's what's called the Deus Ex Machina in tragedy, later tragedy, where the god or the goddess comes and simply says, "I know this could go on forever, but this is where it's going to end, and this is how it's going to end." And that's the end of the Odyssey.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Professor. And I just want to linger a little bit on this complicated man, Odysseus. He seems he's a man's man. He can attract and woo not just normal women, but divine women. He's brilliant. He's a tactical genius. He's also a great warrior. I wonder, in antiquity, we have Achilles who has, he's a legendary figure that, someone like Alexander is looking up to. Does Odysseus enjoy a similar level of influence?
No. So, interestingly, we have a play by Sophocles in which Odysseus is the key character. It's called the Philoctetes. Philoctetes is one of the heroes who, having been wounded by a snake bite, has a gangrened foot or leg, and is dumped by the warriors on the way to Troy on an uninhabited island. The problem is that Philoctetes is the owner of Heracles' bow, and all the prophecies said that Philoctetes and his bow need to be at Troy if Troy is going to actually be destroyed. So he needs to be there. So what happens in the play Philoctetes is this poor man is on the island with his suppurating leg, and Odysseus and his companions come by ship to get him to Troy because, the war has been going on and they know that it won't end until Philoctetes and his bow are there. And one of Odysseus' companions, is the son of Achilles, Neoptolemus, who's a young man. And in this play, what you have is a contrast between Odysseus, who's keen to fool Philoctetes, to trick him into giving up the bow first of all, and then to trick him into coming with them to Troy, since you can't just take the bow with you. So he's coming up with all these plans, and he doesn't care at all about Philoctetes, who hates his guts because Philoctetes says he was one of the ones who basically left me here. And that is the contrast with Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles, who in other bits of later history is actually not seen in very good light because he kills Priam and so on. He's really rather brutal in the Aeneid of Virgil, for example. But here he is a very noble young man. And he decides, you know what? We haven't been able to fool Philoctetes to give us his bow. there's no point in doing it anyway because we have to bring the man with us to Troy. And I am not going to persuade him to come to Troy with us because I just don't think it's the right thing to do. And so you have an impasse at the end of that. And the impasse is solved by this Deus Ex. Heracles just comes down from heaven and he says, no, Philoctetes, you're going to Troy with your bow because Troy has to be destroyed. And it won't unless that happens. Very unsatisfactory from a purely dramatic point of view, because we want to know, well, they decided that it was real impasse and Neoptolemus wasn't going to do the dirty on Philoctetes. But the point I'm making, I suppose, is that Odysseus is seen as too tricky. He's not necessarily the kind of character that a noble, warlike, and success-oriented individual like, say, Alexander the Great would be interested in emulating or in feeling that he wants to be like. So, surprisingly, in a way, perhaps, there isn't the same kind of desire to treat Odysseus as a hero that one would emulate.
Understood. Excellent. And I wanted to end with just 3 rapid-fire questions. The first is, if you were going to take a quote from either the Iliad or the Odyssey and put it on a bracelet and send it or sell it to 1 million people, what would that quote be?
So, in the Odyssey, at one stage, Odysseus says to himself he's going through these terrible, dangerous upheavals. And he says, be resilient, my spirit. He addresses his spirit, or heart. He says, because you've suffered worse in the past. In Greek, tetlatide kradie kai kunteronallo potot. Okay, let's go to the Iliad, where I would say that there's a lovely moment where 2 heroes meet on the battlefield, a Greek and a Trojan, the Diomedes and Glaucus. And Diomedes addresses Glaucus in a very boastful way, saying, "You want to die by my sword? Anyway, who are you?" And Glaucus says, "Don't ask who I am, because hoie per phylon genee to andron." And that means, just as is the generation of leaves, so is that of men. And he goes on to say, leaves bloom in the spring, they die in the winter, and they fall to the ground. And then when the spring comes, new leaves appear. And so he's saying, in a sense, we're insignificant. Doesn't matter who we are. But on the other hand, he's talking about the fact that we are here. We are the leaves at the moment. So it goes 2 ways. Life for this brief moment is important, but in the great cycle of life, none of us are anything. And it turns out that Diomedes and Glaucus have got a guest friendship, so a relationship going back to their fathers from old time, and they recognize this, and they make friends on the battlefield. They shake hands, and they exchange armor, which is what you do as a friend. You say, "Well, I'll take your armor, you take mine." But then Homer makes a very unusual authorial comment at that point. He says, but Glaucus must have lost his wit, because his armor was made of gold and Diomedes' armor was made of bronze. His armor was 9 times worth that of Diomedes. But that's what happens. And so it's again one up for the Greeks. They're the clever ones. They get the gold armor in exchange for bronze.
And then let's imagine there's a bunch of lessons to be taken from the Odyssey. What is one lesson you think is at the background of it all?
Well, resilience pays off. That's certainly one very strong lesson. I think there's an interesting lesson for those who read it today, and that is that we haven't lost our taste for vengeance, because it is a story of great vengeance, and yet people can talk about retribution, they can talk about punishment, all these nice legal and criminological ways of talking about retaliation, but that is a story of huge and excessive vengeance, and it's one that people still enjoy, and they
Yeah.
enjoy that. So that's something that we should take away. Human beings have not lost our taste for it.
And then final question. There are a number of translations of the Odyssey. Do you have a translation that you prefer over others?
I would say that there are a lot of good translations. The one that was the basis of Nolan's film was that of Emily Wilson, which, in many ways is a brilliant translation. It's in an English meter, the iambic pentameter. It's line by line, which means that quite a lot has to be removed, actually, because you can't always get a full hexameter into a single iambic line. And it has choices of words which Emily Wilson justifies in her introduction, but some people have taken a lot of exception to. I mean, you used the word complicated man earlier, and that comes out of Wilson's translation, tell me muse of a complicated man. The Greek polytropos, a man of many wiles or many ways or many turnings. How do you translate it? It's a complicated word. I think there are lots of good verse translations, famously Latimore, Fagles, which I like very much, and recently Mendelssohn's, which I haven't read. There are a lot of good prose translations as well. I was brought up with E.B. Rue in the Penguin Classics, which is kind of romanticized and a bit sort of everyday, but great fun, I think, for a starter. And there's no reason, I think, to be dismissive of that. Martin Hammond's translation in the Oxford World Classics, and and even Lawrence of Arabia translated the Odyssey, T.E. Lawrence. So lots of different ways of thinking about it, and I would say pick a couple of translations, ideally, and see how they differ, maybe a verse and a prose translation. If you're not going to read it in Greek, then you'll get different views of what that Greek should feel like.
Understood. Again, Professor, thank you so much for your time and this excellent conversation. I want to remind listeners that the professor is going to be teaching a course. I will include the link when I upload this video on the Odyssey, starting, I believe, July 20th. So, take the course. It's going to be awesome. And with that, again, Professor, any last words, anything you'd like to say?
Enjoy the film, and I think I will. And let's have a good discussion about it.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor.